What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we have the second episode in our 2021 player breakdown series. We did DeAndre Swift versus J.K. Dobbins last week, so check that out if you haven't already. Today we're doing Evans versus Godwin, and as always, if you've got another combination of players you want me to go over, I have a list of all the ones you guys suggested in last video, but feel free to put that in the comment section of this one. Tweet them at me at NickSalikFFA. I'm going to try and do the ones that people are most often requesting. Also remember that the draft package is 15% off now through the end of April. I've revamped the rankings this season, added a lot of the things you guys have requested from the previous seasons, and so it's definitely an improvement. And obviously, it's better to get the discount than waiting and paying full price. So let's start things off as usual, the side of the day. In 2020, Phillip Rivers and one other quarterback led the league in average yards after the catch per completion. Who was the other quarterback? The answer is Aaron Rodgers, and Alan Buckner was first to get that on YouTube, and Feigeman, something like that. Feigeman John was the first to get that right on Twitter. Today's stat: there were 5 running backs with over 3,000 rushing yards since 2018. Derrick Henry, Ezekiel Elliott, Nick Chubb, Dalvin Cook, and what other player? All right, let's start this breakdown. Now, this one's going to be slightly different than most breakdowns we do because these two are obviously on the same team, right? So a big factor of what we're looking at in each player is, well, how good or bad of an offense are they going to be on, right? Like, can we count on one player to be much more likely to be part of, a top 5 offense, and another one guy's in a bottom 5 offense, and that can be a very big differentiator. We don't have that here. The Bucs are going to be a very good team, and they're the first team in the salary cap era to return all 22 of their starters after winning the Super Bowl. So if there is any team out there that we know is going to be the same as the previous season, it's the Bucs. We can expect a lot of the same things to be consistent, whereas some other teams are seeing so many changes, there's a little bit more risk to the players. Now, like I said again, both players are on this team, so it's not something we can look at as a differentiator. It's just nice to know the offense is going to operate very similarly to what we saw last season. So there's very little we do not know here, which is really nice because we can be a lot more accurate in our predictions. So you guys asked me to break this down because it's close. You're going to see in the video, it is very, very close. Either of these two could finish in the top 5, but let's just see what we're going to do here. So we'll start off with Evans. He's going to be 28 when the season starts, so still in that age apex where we're expecting an elite season, right? He should not be on the downturn yet in his career. And he's also coming off his 7th consecutive 1,000-yard season. I feel like we take Mike Evans for granted sometimes, but he has begun his career with 7 consecutive 1,000-yard seasons. You know how many other wide receivers have ever done that? 0. He is the only wide receiver in the history of the NFL to start his season or start his career with 7 consecutive 1,000-yard seasons. That's incredible. And he's never played fewer than 13 games, never had fewer than 67 receptions. He's averaged nearly 9 touchdowns per year. So why do people shy away? Well, he's consistent from like a season-long standpoint if you look at the total at the end of the season, but he is very up and down throughout the season. Even look at last season. He finished as the wide receiver 13 in points per game, but digging a little bit deeper, he only ranked inside the top 15 wide receivers in 5 out of 16 weeks, finishing outside the top 47 6 times. So he was a wide receiver 5 more often than he was a top 15 wide receiver. It's really just those blow-up games for Evans. In weeks 4, 6, and 8, he had 7 for 104 and a touchdown, 7 for 122 and a touchdown, 10 for 181 and 2 touchdowns. That's nearly 77 fantasy points in 3 games, which is 36% of his total output across 3 games. And the crazy part is, it wasn't because of the touchdowns, right? Like, he scored 13 times across the season, so in theory, that should have made him very consistent. Unfortunately, he did see the lowest total volume of his career, and that resulted in 7 games with 3 or fewer receptions, and that's really going to hurt his floor. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm saying that he was bad, because that's not true at all. He was the wide receiver 13 in points per game, and he absolutely won people a few matchups just on his own, which is something that plenty of wide receivers are just not capable of, right? Like, there are a lot of receivers out there who in any given week can really help you get the win, but are not going to be the sole reason. Mike Evans could be the reason you win a matchup, because he drops 40, and it's very difficult for your opponent to make up for a receiver dropping 40. But he is very inconsistent in his output, and I know that that can be frustrating for a lot of you. You know, when he goes 7 for 104 and a touchdown one week, and then follows up with 2 receptions for 2 yards while playing 90% of the snaps, like not just getting injured. And the question becomes, what will happen if the touchdowns dry up? Because 13 touchdowns is insane, and that's not something you should expect to consistently happen on average over time. So what does that mean for his floor, median outcome, and ceiling? Over the last 3 seasons, he has 8, 8, and 13 touchdowns. Playing on this offense, I don't expect those numbers to crater, right? Like, we did see the one year we had 3 touchdowns, but in this offense, with how consistent he's been, not only being used in the red zone, but just converting in the red zone, converting from deep as well, I'd be very surprised if he had a full season played and then 3 touchdowns, right? So it's tough for me to see in a 17-game season. Remember, there's 1 extra week this season. It's tough for me to see him falling below like 8 touchdowns if he were to play every single game. And that's what we're going to do in this projection, is say, assuming they play every single week, because, I mean, if he plays like 15 weeks, yeah, he could score fewer than 8 touchdowns. But across 17 games, he's probably going to score at least 8 touchdowns. We use that as a floor, 10 as an average, because I do think we see a pullback from 13. And then we'll say 15 is his ceiling outcome, because he could absolutely score 15 touchdowns. But again, ceiling outcome is like top 15%. Could he have just an unbelievably lucky season and score 20? Sure. But that's a little unrealistic to project as a ceiling. We'll project him at 15 for like a best case kind of outcome. For receptions, he's between 4.4 and 5.4 each of the last 3 seasons, but he was on the lower end of his likely outcome this last season, basically because they have so many capable weapons. Like, if it was only him and Godwin, we could kind of make the floor a little bit higher, but since, like I said, they have so many different players that they can use, I think 4 per game is a nice floor, 4.4 as the average, and then 5 as his ceiling. And then finally, we just need to look at yards per reception. He was up to like 17 with Winston at quarterback, dropped to 14.4 with Brady. That makes a lot of sense, right? Winston is much more willing to take chances deep, and he's also, going to turn it over a ton, and so they were playing from behind a lot. They were forced to throw the ball deep, and he was more willing to do so. So that kind of combination brings him to 17 per reception, but we should not expect that under Brady. We should expect him to be closer to that 14. His worst season was 13.8, so we're going to use that as a floor. His 14.4 from last season, I'm going to use that as like an average outcome, and then 16 as a ceiling if he can get lucky on a few deep balls, because Brady's still going to throw deep. Brady's still solid deep, and so could he have, 2 80-yard touchdowns on the season because he gets loose deep, and that really helps his yard per reception? Absolutely, that could happen. And so we'll project that as a ceiling of 16. So what does that look like? Across 17 games, that's a floor of about 68 receptions for just under 940 yards and 8 touchdowns. That would come out to 10 points per game, and the wide receiver 42 as a floor. But as we get to, I think that's less likely to happen. But that's his absolute floor across 17 games. His median outcome is about 75 receptions, a little under 1,100 yards, 10 touchdowns, which comes out to about 12 points per game. That would be the wide receiver 20 on average. I think that's much more likely to happen than the wide receiver 42. And then a ceiling, 85 receptions, about 1,360 yards, those 15 touchdowns, which would be 16 points per game, and would be about top 5. Top 5 is tough to say where you're going to be in there because someone could have a monster season. We could see no one have the season like Devonta Adams had last year. So in that top 5, I don't want to say exactly where, but 16 points per game is going to get you in that range. So like I said, floor, about wide receiver 42 on average wide receiver 20 with a top 5 ceiling. And honestly, a lot of that makes sense. On average, he should score fewer touchdowns and drop a little bit from what he was last season. Remember, he was wide receiver 13 in points per game last season. But, he could have a few dud games and go way back. He could have more explosion games and jump up. So I think that range is really solid to project him in. We could see a season like in 2016 where he was the wide receiver 2 behind Jordy Nelson. So wide range for Mike Evans, but realistically I think he's probably going to fall in that wide receiver 10 to 20 range because the touchdowns should be there. Like I said, he's probably not going to only score 3. He's just not going to be peppered with targets, so I think those 85 receptions are also a little bit unlikely. So I would expect around 12 half PPR points per game. Comes out to closer to 14 and a half in full PPR, which is a slight downgrade because, again, those receptions are a little bit lower than average, but it's not a huge difference, but a very small ding in full PPR. So where does Godwin compare? Well, he's entering his 5th season at age 25, but he only has one 1,000-yard season under his belt. So keep that in mind. I love Chris Godwin, and so does a large portion of the fantasy football community. But across his first 4 seasons in the NFL, he's only got over 850 receiving yards one time. Whereas, like we said with Mike Evans, he's never been under 1,000 yards. And while I've certainly made the excuse, and a lot of people have, that, he wasn't getting full run, right? They just hadn't unleashed him yet. Well, okay, but Mike Evans had no issue, instantly commanding playing time. It didn't take him 3 years to finally get a full snap share because Adam Humphries was playing ahead of him, right? I just feel like that needs to be pointed out, is that, yes, Godwin wasn't getting full run in his first few seasons, and that's why his numbers are lower, but Mike Evans instantly came in and commanded that target share. Chris Godwin did not. So it just needs to be pointed out. Again, I love Godwin, but you have to admit that Mike Evans does have the better track record at this point. When Godwin did finally put it all together in 2019, though, he was incredible. He had 86 receptions, 1,333 yards, 9 touchdowns across 14 games, finishing as a wide receiver 2 in half PPR points per game, right ahead of Evans, who was 3rd. Then this past season, he got a little bit banged up, but he still finished with about 70 receiving yards per game, 15th in fantasy points per game, just 0.2 behind Mike Evans. Now, we don't have as much data when projecting Chris Godwin, so it's not going to be as accurate, as we're pretty sure we've got a nice accurate projection with Mike Evans. But, his play with Brady was fairly consistent. And on average, we should expect him to be around that 5.5 receptions per game range. It's falling somewhere in 4.5 to 6.5. So we'll kind of use those as the floor, median, and ceiling. He should also be around 1.5 yards fewer yards per reception than Mike Evans. Of course, Mike Evans just works deeper downfield. And so on average over time, Godwin is going to have fewer yards per reception than Evans. And so if we drop that down about 1.5 and still bring that about 1 above and below that range for a floor and a ceiling, kind of similar to what we did with Evans, it's a good projection for Godwin's yards per reception. Touchdowns, also, we do expect that to be lower than Evans as well. Evans ranked 2nd behind Devonta Adams with 14 targets inside the 10-yard line, whereas Godwin only had 7. And even if we account for a few missed games, Godwin was still only on a 16-game pace of just over 9. They just use him a little bit less when they get really close to the end zone. So if we're giving Evans 10 touchdowns on average, Godwin should be closer to 8. It's not a huge difference, but he should see a little bit fewer. And since he is used less close to the end zone, his floor and ceiling also just need to be lower. So on a 17-game pace, we're going to say 6 as a floor for Godwin, 8 as an average, with 12 as a ceiling because, we have seen him produce in the touchdown area, not even playing in a full season. And so if he got really lucky, like 12 is in his range of outcomes for sure. So what does that look like kind of across a 17-game season? That's a floor of about 77 receptions, just under 920 yards and 6 touchdowns, or 9.8 fantasy points per game, which also comes out to, on average, wide receiver 42. Median outcome, 94 receptions, 1,215 yards, 8 touchdowns. That's 12.7 fantasy points per game, which is on average wide receiver 19. Remember, Evans was wide receiver 20. And then a ceiling, 111 receptions, 1,547 yards, 12 touchdowns. That's 16.6 fantasy points per game, which again is top 5 wide receiver. It's about half a fantasy points per game more than we had Evans at, but it's still going to be in that wide receiver like 2 to 5 kind of range. You got to think someone has higher than that, so it's probably not 1, but it's close to that range. But put another way, it is virtually the same outlook as Mike Evans. But that makes sense, right? I mean, we should expect Evans to score more touchdowns than Godwin and hold a higher yards per reception, but for Godwin to end the season with more receptions, making up for that difference. So then who do we draft if the projections are virtually the same? For me, it comes down to the likelihood of each outcome. So we talk about floor and ceiling, but those are not equally likely outcomes for every single player. Not everyone follows a bell curve distribution, right? Like if everyone was a bell curve, we'd be like, oh, ceiling and floor are exactly the same likelihood to happen, with the average happening right in the middle. That is not the case for everyone. Mike Evans is far less likely to hit the low end of his projection than Godwin is. Again, we've seen at least 1,000 yards every single season of Mike Evans' career. So what's more likely to happen? That he doesn't hit that for the first time ever, or that he hits that, right? Like again, he's playing with Tom Brady as his quarterback. Given the chemistry he had last season, it's very hard to imagine that Mike Evans is not going to push for the league lead in touchdowns. And since these two have, the same floor, median, and ceiling outcomes, but Mike Evans is far less likely to hit his floor and far more likely to hit his average and ceiling, I am going to rank Mike Evans ahead of Chris Godwin. That is not how I had it before. It is also probably a surprise to a lot of you because of how much I like Chris Godwin, but you just can't discount that consistency. Since his rookie season in 2014, Mike Evans has been the wide receiver 12, 27, 2, 19, 9, 3, and 13 in points per game. So that's 6 out of 7 years he's been a top 20 wide receiver in points per game, with his only dud, if you can even call it that, being his sophomore season when he had 74 receptions, 1,206 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Even, starting the season injured, missing week 1, being a decoy in week 2, that's still a really, really good season. He just does not dud. And so I get the concerns over the weekly poor performances, but it's not like Godwin is immune to that, right? He's still ranked outside the top 45 in 25% of his games last season, cracking 20 points per game only one time, and it was in week 17 when Evans played 11 snaps because the game was in hand, right? So I am fine accepting that Evans is going to have slightly more dud games, but you're not going to avoid a dud for anyone. Basically besides Devonta Adams and maybe Stephon Diggs, there are just very, very few wide receivers who are dud proof. You're going to get them, right? And so I'll accept a slightly higher rate of that if I know across the full season Mike Evans is going to have a good year and he's going to win me 2 or 3 weeks solely on his own. And the dud weeks, they're not necessarily losing it for me, right? If he only scores 5 fantasy points in a week, that's not a guaranteed loss. But when he drops 40, I probably won. And so I am willing to take on more of that variance because, again, I know over a full season, he's going to be great. And since, again, he's got the same outcomes for floor, median, ceiling, but he's more likely to hit that median and ceiling than Godwin is, I'm going to rank them ahead. It's only one spot. I still like both of them a lot. But if you're in that range, which a lot of you are going to be at some point this season, and you're like, well, down to these two, I'm picking Mike Evans. So that'll do it for this player breakdown. Let me know what comparison you want to see in the next one. And remember that you can use the promo code FFA now through the end of April to get 15% off any of the packages on the website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That, my friends, is the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting the like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.